Even as I think about those that have gone, that we've lost this year, I also am always reminded of this other image that comes to my mind, and that image is of all God's saints surrounding God's throne, all together worshiping God. That all of us one day will all be together again in God's house, celebrating, joyous, no tear, no sorrow, no suffering anymore, no pain anymore. This image of heaven that we base our hope in Jesus Christ in, that this is not the end. And so we have that hope as Christians. And it's interesting that today we're talking about key relationships and investing in key relationships, because we've been remembering some key relationships in our lives as we've been working through this study together. So I was thinking about how we get connected in our society today, and so I looked at my cell phone, and I looked at the apps I have on my cell phone, and many of them are social apps for social media, like Facebook, Instagram. In fact, if you're over 40, you're probably on Facebook. If you're 18, you're probably using Snapchat, LinkedIn. What others am I missing? Twitter, right? What else? Pinterest. What? Instagram, right? You know, I'm glad nobody said Ashley Madison. That's good. So I want you to. So I went online and did a little of my online research, and you can't believe everything you read online, by the way. But just keep in mind. So I went and I said, what is the average number of connections for each of these social apps? And so I just took my phone, and these are apps on my phone. And so here it is. Facebook, the average person has 350 friends on Facebook. Instagram, I thought this was a little high, but 843 followers on Instagram. The average Twitter account has 208 followers. The average LinkedIn account has 393 connections. And Snapchat, they don't keep track of that number of connections or friends, but they estimate, and this is a pretty broad estimation, between 20 and 50 snaps per day that each person gets. So if you're actually 18, you're probably using Snapchat more now than you'd use text messaging, because that's become the wave of the younger generation. If you're over 40, as I already said, you're probably on Facebook. So the next generation is not on Facebook. They're using Snapchat and Instagram more so often. So I thought about this, and I've mentioned this before in a sermon, and I saw it again. Our family pizza night, we go out for pizza on Friday night, and I saw it once again, a family around the dinner table, not talking to each other, all of them on their phones. And I could tell that one of them was checking Facebook, because as I could look across the restaurant, I could see the blue border, the Facebook colored border, and I could see just by them scrolling through, they were checking Facebook as they sat there at the dinner table with their family. That is about 1,800 connections. So think about this. Is it possible that we, in our efforts to keep up with all 1,800 people, we're actually missing some significant key in relationships in our lives that are right in front of us? The people that God put in our lives. But so we're so busy trying to stay connected that we're neglecting those key important relationships in our lives. And that maybe what we're doing with our relationships is the same thing that the Israelites were doing with the land. The prophet Isaiah said, you who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is room for no one but you, and you are left to live alone in the midst of the land. Wow. See, what they were doing was they kept joining plot to plot, acre to acre, lot to lot, and they were leaving no margin for anything else in their lives. And they were leaving no space for just nature to happen, for things organic to happen. And so because they were neglecting the land by doing that. Now, you and I, we live in a society where we intentionally set aside parkland, because we know as a society, as humans, we'll just keep building houses if we don't make green space, right? If we don't create margins for recreation. So we do that with our land. What I'm suggesting is when we overcommit our time, we overcommit our schedules, we overcommit to all these relationships, we're doing the same thing. We're not creating any space for God to work. in our relationships. And so what we're left with is just what the Israelites were left with, and that is no margins. And for us, no margin for key relationships. So by keeping ourselves so busy and so connected, we're actually neglecting possibly the key relationship. We've not created the margins in life for those key relationships to happen. Yet God created us for relationships. So I'm playing with Legos again today. So I want you to think about this. You come into the world like this, open to connection. You're born into this world created for relationships and key relationships. And if you're lucky, and if you were born in the right place, you have two parents. And those are the first two key relationships you have in your life. And do we have any parents of infants in the house today? Infants, that's the infant corner over there, the young, they're like, right? So all of you back in there, so let me ask this question. How much time do you invest in your children right now? Right, you don't need to answer it. I know the answer to that. I'm a dad, I'm a father, right? You invest a tremendous amount of time in those. So those are the first two key relationships, most significant relationships in our lives are to our parents. And God gave us those parents. And parents, God gave us those children. So they are given to us. We are created. We are put into families. That's the way God created us. And so those are significant relationships. And then as we get older, we might have brothers and sisters, right? And then we have some more key relationships, right? And they may not always get along. I get that, mom and dad, right? I get that, brothers and sisters. We not always get along, but they're probably going to be a key, significant relationship for you the rest of your life. These people in your family are going to be with you through your whole life. They're going to be key, significant relationship for your whole life, whether you like them or not. So think about that. And then as we mature and get older, we start to develop friendships with some close friends, maybe some friends that we get along with and we start to connect with and we spend time with and we invest time in them. You know, I made friendships when I grew up not on Facebook. There was no Facebook when I grew up. We went out and did stuff in the woods, me and the guy. We went out and built forts and we did stuff together, and that bonded us together. So we create friendships. We know what it's like to invest time in key relationships. And then life goes on, and hopefully one of those relationships we've learned about and grown up with is God. And then if you have all those relationships and you have those key relationships, then things are solid. You know, you can put something on this. It'll hold up. But I think what we're doing today is not that. As we get older, what we're doing is we're pushing those relationships aside and we're becoming more loosely connected. And when we do that and when we extend out to many, many more relationships and we're loosely connected to each other, that's what we're doing. We're filling up one of the key relational connections with all these other connections, but they're loosely connected, right? And so when stress hits us in life, what happens? We fall apart. If we've invested in key relationships, what happens when stress hits us? We stay intact. Because this is the way God created us, folks. This is how God created us, to be in significant relationship and invest in significant relationships throughout our whole life. So I'm going to give you some strategery this morning. So I'm not going to spell it. Isaiah 5, not Isaiah, but in the book Momentum for Life, it says this, and this is true, and this is something that we have to get our heads around. Mike Slaughter said, all people are equally important to God, but not all are equally strategic for the expenditure of your time for God's purpose. Let's read that together. All people are equally important to God, but not all are equally strategic for the expenditure of your time for God's purpose. Think about that. So what would it look like for us to be strategic about the investment of our time, because I think right now we're not being that strategic. I will confess that myself. I'm not always strategic in how I use my time because I get pulled in a lot of different directions and trying to keep up with lots of connections, and so I get stressed this way. And so that's something that I deal with. But I want you to see what I would do in a perfect world if I were better at being at my strategery. Here's how things would line up for me. Here's what I strive for. So notice in the psalm today, the first thing the psalmist says, because the psalmist describes a fruitful, productive family. And I wanted to give you a little symbolism here this morning in Psalm 128. The first thing, it talks about the spouse being a fruitful vine, and it was referring to the vine. The vine is symbolic, folks, of peace and tranquility. So one of the things is that you'll have peace and tranquility in your marriage, okay? And then the other thing, the children are described as olive shoots. And those olive shoots were symbolic of longevity and productivity. And if you were an agrarian society and you had children, would you want them to live a long time and be productive workers? Right, that's important, right, to the family. So the psalmist is describing this flourishing and vital family. The number one key relationship in that family described, there's one key relationship that is number one in the strategy of all family relationships. And where do we find it? Look at verse 1 in 128. It says what? Who is the number one relationship of all our relationships? God, right? That if I don't make a connection with God, if I don't have God number one in my life, it has an impact on the rest of my life. Here's how this works. When I have a relationship with God, it starts to shape and change my character. It starts to influence my choices. It makes me look at my behavior and look at wisdom and how can I live and be the person that God created in me. So my relationship with God has an impact on me that then has an impact on the others around me. So that's the first point is being strategic, is saying I've got to make sure that my relationship with God, I'm investing in that relationship that forms and shapes me. And so because that's going to impact my spouse, that's going to impact my children, that's going to impact my family, it's going to impact the way I relate to my parents, it's going to impact the way I relate to friends. I mean, it just trickles out. Sorry to borrow from Reaganomics, but that's what happens. So that's what happens. So number 2 mentioned in the psalm, but I want to lift this up because I think sometimes we skip over this one, is our spouse. You know, when we got married, how many people here are married today? Currently marital status, right? A lot of you, yeah. I want you to think about this. When you stood before that priest, pastor, judge, whatever, and you got married, here's my belief about that, what happened there. Because I'm a Christian pastor. I believe you're standing before God and you're making a commitment to God, and you're saying to this other person that you're committing to lifelong, other than God, you're the number one priority in my life from this day forward. Think about that. Now, I don't remember my wedding day. I was like a deer in the headlights. But I know that happened. How many people can remember their wedding day? Every guy's hand should go up right now. You do not. That's a key. You stood before God and you stood before other people and you said to that person, you are the number one priority in my life other than God. Think about that. Think about what you said, what you committed to. And if you will seek peace and tranquility in that relationship, then your family will flourish. So you see how this strategy starts to work? God, spouse. And then if we have children, then we add children into the mix. And some of us have children, some of us don't. But when we do have children, that's another priority that God has given us. Parents, we made a choice. We made a decision at some point, whether we agree with that decision or not. But we made that decision, and those people came into our lives. You know, I want to say this. Your children are your mission field. You know, a lot of times we talk about missions to Hurley, and that's great. I mean, I'm not saying don't do mission trips. I'm not saying don't go to Chrisfield, don't go overseas, don't go on these mission trips. I'm not saying don't do that. What I'm saying, though, is if I start to get strategic and I start to prioritize your mission field, your first and primary mission field is your family. It's the mission field that God gave you. It's number one. And so if that mission field needs to be worked on and be a part of your priority, your strategy for investing in key relationships. And we're not to neglect our families for the sake of that mission. As we sometimes say to the leaders of our church, I've said, and again, something I say, it's easier to say than do, is I say, we're not required to sacrifice our families on the altar of ministry. We're not required to sacrifice our families on the altar of the mission field. We serve God. God's number one. We committed to a spouse and said, you're a priority. And when we had kids, God gave us that mission field. That's a God-given mission field right in front of us every day. And folks, kids catch it. It's caught, not taught. They're going to do what we do. And we are always, moms and dads, we are always the key relationship throughout their life. We're building stuff into them, good and bad. So I want it to always be more good than bad. We're not going to get everything perfect, but that's a key relationship we have to be looking at and investing in. There's another thing that's talked about in the Bible that is another key relationship that I would put in this strategy, and that is our parents. How many people have aging parents? Yeah, a lot of us. And caring for aging parents is something, again, who gave us our parents? Did we choose them? No, God gave them to us. Again, it's part of our mission field that God has already given us, and they need our care. In fact, Jesus warned the Pharisees. He said, you guys keep being real religious and real godly, and you're doing great things for God, but you're neglecting your parents. And that's wrong. Don't use God as an excuse to neglect your parents. That's what Jesus said. That's what Jesus taught. So he actually took care of his mom. Even when he left this life, he was taking care of his mom. He said to John, John, take care of my mom. He was making sure his mother was taken care of even though he was going on to heaven. And so he was taking care of Mary. And so we have to think about that. Our parents, our aging parents, are another key relationship that need to be invested in. Not because they invested in us, but because we're called to care for them. Not out of guilt, but out of part of our mission field, what God calls us to do. And then I think another key relationship for us in that line of strategy, it would be close friends. I think we all need close friends. We may or may not all feel like we have them, but I would say we need them. God created us for them. Because those close friendships are the people, and the people I'm talking about are the people who are not on Facebook. I'm not talking about the people on Instagram. I'm not talking about the people on Snapchat. I'm talking about the people who, when you mess up, they're still going to be there for you. That if you fail, they're still going to love you. They're going to forgive you. They're going to help get you back on your feet. They've got your back no matter what. And you hopefully have some friends like that. And you don't need a lot of them. Just a couple of them are great. If you got more than a couple, it's all right. But if you get too many, then you're trying to maintain too many close relationships. And here's what I would say, close the circle. Start to evaluate those friendships and say, okay, who are the ones that I need to invest in, who got my back, who will love me no matter what? Because some of those friendships may not do that. And so may have some wisdom about how you're investing in those relationships. And I'm not saying don't be a nice person, don't have friends, don't be friendly. I'm just saying be strategic in how you invest your time. And then the last thing I would say is leave one of these connections open. Open for God's purpose. Because there may be somebody that God's put in your life that God does want you to make a connection with, that God does want you to invest in, to mentor, to make a difference in their life, to share your faith with. But you actually get intentional and spend time with them over a long period of time, and you stay in relationship with them over time. That happens throughout the Bible. Paul had a Barnabas, and Paul had a Timothy, which means Paul had someone mentoring him, and Paul was mentoring somebody. So he had someone who was investing in him, and he was investing in somebody else in a key relationship. He wasn't investing in everybody. He was just saying, I'm going to invest in you, Timothy, as much as I can throughout our ministry. So that's important to have those key relationships, to be open to what God does. Notice that this is not God's purpose. Key relationship with God's purpose is not synonymous with your relationship with God. Did you notice that? Sometimes we get that confused. We think that when we're serving God, that we're actually putting God's purpose first, but actually it's our relationship to God that needs to be first. And God will reveal the purpose, but God's already given us, if we have a spouse, already given us children, already given us parents that are our mission field. So God wouldn't ask us to neglect those folks, those key relationships for the sake of another, if that's that mission field that God's given us. So keep that in mind in your strategy. Again, something I strive for, something I don't always get right. I'm getting better at it. So the question really for us today is, are we spending enough time with the important people in your life? What can you be doing? Which of these connections do you need to work on so that you're more solid? Relationship to God, parents, children, spouse, friends, God's purposes. Where do you need to be investing more time? It's interesting that we celebrate All Saints Day. I didn't plan it this way. I didn't line the book up with today's celebration of people's lives, but I've had the opportunity to do most of the funerals of those folks that we named today. And I've talked with all those families. And as I sit there with them, and they usually sit here in the front row of our church as we celebrate their life. And if they could speak to us today, if I could line them up here on the stage and say, what would you tell everybody here about that significant relationship in your life? I think I know what they'd say. I bet every one of them would say this. Or let me put it this way, I don't think any of them would have said this. I wish I had spent more time on Facebook. I wish I had spent more time at the office. I wish I had spent more time checking my email. I wish I had spent more time on Instagram or Snapchat or watching TV or entertaining myself. They would have all wished for just one more day to just be with that person. Not on any of those things, not doing any of those things, just be with them. They long for just one more day of significant relationship. That's what they tell you. If you only had one more day, how would you invest it with that person? Because that's what matters. Because as I said, at many of those funerals, every time I sit in there before people, we never talk a little bit, but we don't really talk about their accomplishments, their degrees, their careers. What people remember about others, these saints, is how they loved. People will remember you for how you love them, not for what you did in life. Amen.